Hey everyone, thanks for joining this one-off meeting. I mean, currently one-off, but maybe more to talk about Gamma, what are plans for 2025, and kind of get some feedback and see what's everyone's top of mind. Just a just a small reminder, this meeting is governed by CNCF Code of Conduct, which essentially comes down to just be nice to each other, be welcoming, and yeah, if anyone in this room, I guess I know most of the people, but if anyone wants to introduce himself, so can just let a few minutes.
I actually don't think I've ever met Rajat,
Yeah.
and I apologize for mispronouncing your name in
No,
advance.
no, I think that's very accurate. And I think I usually am a fly on the wall in most of the calls, like in all the Istio calls and the Gateway API calls. Here to represent like, I guess, the user side of things. I'm mostly interested in like just keeping track on what's going on.
Well, you're probably going to be the most valuable person then if you represent the user side.
We like having people represent users.
Awesome.
And do you know all of us, or should we?
Oh yeah. No,
Okay,
no, I need to know everyone.
just making sure. Also, Leor, I think that was a fine job of the CNCF Code of Conduct. Nicely done.
Thanks so much. I'm glad it's recorded and I have this feedback as well on file. Okay. Yeah, I think what I had in mind, I tried to like talk with different people, see what they have in mind. But what I had in mind essentially is, I wanted to hear like, what are the previous plans, things we, like we'd hoped to do before and didn't get to. Just even like current, kind of, I have some ideas in mind, but I also wanted to know, like, kind of get the sense from the room, like, if Gamma is still a priority for us. What is, like, if it's just, whether it's time that we don't have or whether priority has changed, like, what people would really, how would people would hope to see Gamma evolve in 2025, if at all. And then we can jump into specific stuff that, some ideas on what to do and stuff like that. Does that sound?
I shall go last,
Okay.
since I always go first.
Okay. Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for first of all setting this up, Lior. I think this is good to sort of regroup and figure out what our priorities are. I think from my point of view, and I think we talked about this a little bit at KubeCon. What city were we just in? Utah, Salt Lake City. Um, one of the I think one of the main reasons for me where there hasn't been a lot of gamma specific movement is that fundamentally the initial work for Gamma was figuring out a way to fit East-West within the Gateway API model. And I think to a large degree, we've been able to do that. And so now, the reason that we even stopped the separate Gamma meetings was because I think that we've been able to make that work. There is a way to, have a parent ref to service. We in a lot of the ancillary conversations we've been having around policy, around auth, are all back into us policy even. When we're discussing those things, Gamma often is a main use case to solve, right? There's a decision tree at that point of if it's a Gamma supported resource or not. Sort of that as far as like, is there any Gamma specific or mesh specific needs from Gateway API? I think auth is going to be the big one, but I think the thing that we took away from some of the discussions around during KubeCon in November was that maybe the network policy sub project would be the best place to have those conversations. Um, so that's a really long way of saying that I don't think I have anything specifically that I'm looking to get out of sort of the Gamma work stream this year, outside of sort of I'll say it like this. I don't know if there's anything Gamma specific that I'm looking for out of Gateway API this year, but I'm really interested in some of the other Gateway API initiatives that will improve the mesh use case, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks. And to your point, like, quick question, like, when you said that, Gamma, most of East West, like, well, I should call it a basic East West capability with Gamma is supported right now. Do you have any adoption of it? Do you hear users' feedback from it, or is it like, I don't, I like, if there is, it would be nice if you can share. I mean, I have no access to users' feedback for Gamma yet.
As far as I know, all of the meshes that support Gamma see a lot of use of it.
Okay.
I'm looking at Mike and Keith on this one, but like, yeah,
Yeah,
It's a little
and
bit
just
weird.
you actually there are things in Linkerd that you can't do if you don't use the Gateway API resources. So yeah, people use them for, with mostly good success.
yeah, for like ambient mode, we more or less
You require
only
it,
have
right?
pretty much.
Yeah.
Unless for me. For everyone else, it's
It's
Well,
still
I
user.
mean, we assume that you do all sorts of crazy stuff with Istio on a regular basis. So,
So just to be specific, you mean like people putting HTTP routes, people putting services as parent refs, right? Not just general gateway API stuff.
so if you'll forgive my being a little bit blunt, Lior, apparently you never went to see the workshops that Mike and I did on this twice,
Oh,
which
it
is
was
all about
co-located.
this.
It was twice co-located with my talk, like
Yeah, well,
like on the same time.
so we should have fixed that.
I remember
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, in all seriousness, by the way, if that sort of thing happens again, like there's something that looks interesting that collides with a talk of yours, KubeCon can actually tweak the schedule if you talk to him about it. So ping me if that happens, and I know the people to talk to. It's Cody Gallagher, or Galloway, or whatever the hell his name is after he got married.
Yeah.
But yeah, he's great. He's really, really helpful with stuff like that. But yeah, that's, we did this as a workshop because people do it. And there have been a number of talks happening at KubeCon where people talk about how you do this sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's good to hear. Look, I know it's working. Like,
Yeah.
just like
There are other things that we can come to after whoever wants to go next goes next. But the basic east-west routing with Gateway API, yeah, people use it. It works.
awesome. And okay. I mean, I'll be interested to hear, like, usually when people start using something, there are some, feature requests, some things, obviously, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but no singular, like, users today cannot just use gammas, right? Like, they're gonna have to have some, blend of APIs for the sake of, for achieving a full mesh experience, or let's say
I think
50.
that's somewhat inevitable. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
No, I'm not saying it's better now.
Yeah.
I'm just asking, like, is this the right status? Like,
I think some of the use cases, and I'd be interested in hearing more from like John and also like Rajat here, are there specific scenarios where to get the functionality that you require as a user, it's not possible through Gateway API, right? Like if it's your core functionality is possible, you just need to add something else. Like I think that's okay. It's for things like rate limiting, where that's not implementable through Gateway API resources. And I think in Istio, you have to like use a virtual service if you want something rate limited.
Why is that not something that you can add on top though?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Please correct me if I'm wrong on that. Like,
But I just think like, I mean, you're saying that it's fine because the core supports it and you can add other things like rate limiting. We could have a rate limit. We don't have a rate limiting policy, but that's Istio's fault, not Gateway API's fault.
Yeah.
We actually do have a rate limiting policy that goes on top of Gateway API stuff.
Okay, interesting.
We didn't talk about that at KubeCon in Paris, or in Salt Lake rather, because it was unclear until a week before Salt Lake that it was going to land. But yeah, it's there.
you're going to talk about it in the next KubeCon that I can.
So I know that's one of the issues.
Well, the talk was submitted, and I don't know what'll happen to it, but we'll see. Dude, you're not supposed to talk about tracks you're reviewing. Come on.
I'm not. Anyway,
But yeah, so like rate limit is an example of one of the things that is currently a closed issue that it would be wonderful if we could reopen in the next year and do something Gateway API native with it. Yeah, I'm curious, like Rajat, like are there any other blockers that you're aware of, like as a user, for like things that you would like to do that are not possible for you using the Gateway API interfaces?
I think the top thing on like the list for us right now is retry budgets that we are already working on.
Sorry,
I'm
is
sorry,
what?
say again?
The
Retry
retry
budget.
Retry.
budgets.
Oh,
Gotcha.
budget. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And just like in sort of like, I think, is it, I want to get a sense of like, we're saying it's not necessarily a bad thing, but then I'm trying to understand if like, there was the initial motivation to move to any vendor neutral API was, I guess portability, customer preference, right? Like, jump in if you have different opinions, but then where's the balance? Like, I'm trying to think like if we want to go after implementing more and more capabilities into Gamma with the kind of sort of vision of like, okay, I'm a user, I just can use Gamma and I can move my, I don't know, rate limiting policies or like, like the whole mesh experience to a different provider, like similarly like we provide with North South, like, because this is what I'm trying to get a sense from the room. If this is something we want to fund or like we want to do, so probably we want to go after those features and get these users to provide us feedback and then trying to implement more things in Gamma.
Yeah, the only thing from my point of view that, so like everything you said, I think we can do and sounds good if you replace Gamma with Gateway API. The only thing that I think needs to be specific to service mesh, and I'm probably missing something, but is it might have different authorization semantics, which we're already like discussing quite a bit.
Yeah, auth is
Other
going to
than
be
that,
really
like
interesting.
almost everything should be overlapping.
Well, why do you think I was so Kid put a teaser on auth. Like I want to keep it to the end because I think it's a big topic, but it's also the most important one. But just a quick, like, why do you think this should be different?
I mean,
Auth?
it could be the same. Like it just could also be different. Like they're very different use cases of like I'm authorizing an external client versus I have this network level authentication.
It's almost like
I mean,
authentication versus authorization for me. So with a north-south use case, you are assigning identity to the thing that's calling into the cluster. With the east-west use case, you assume to some extent that there is something provisioning the identity, and you're wanting to validate whether or not validate the access. It's not perfect analogy, but that's almost how I think about it. Where north-south use case typically off-in, east-west is more often off-z.
No, but like
I actually look at that kind of differently. North-south auth-in and auth-z tend to be about human users. East-west is about workloads. And those are really, really different cases. Like asking your workload to go through an OAuth flow, I'm sure somebody could make it work, but it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. Likewise, asking your user to do the spiffy workload API seems weird. They're totally different worlds. It may very well be that we can use the same sorts of mechanisms with different principles in many cases, but they're really different use cases, and we should probably not try to lump them together.
I see. I think the confusing part is like, I thought what John meant is like service mesh specific as like service mesh implementation specific, but like I was after like, okay, let's standardize only east-west across service meshes. But now I understand John was after like, service mesh as opposed to, north-south.
Right. That was how I heard John. Or sorry, I should phrase that differently. I also heard John talking about east-west versus north-south. So
okay, yeah.
John, if that is not what you meant, you should jump in now.
Okay, yeah. I guess that's what he meant.
Yeah.
And okay, so why wouldn't talk about that? Like Keith mentioned, like, network policies discussion. That's important. Something, we took from KubeCon. There were some follow-ups still pending more, but like I want to highlight one thing is even though if it ended up in network policy, I guess to be fair, this group are I think as important, because what we want is we want gateway, like we want meshes to implement it, right? Like, network policies have their, CNIs have some kind of implementation of network policy. I mean, to be determined, whether it's going to be a different API, how it is going to be. But I think the input from this group of people that are in the room right now is, like, yes, like even more crucial, right? Because I think the
You
intersection
also
of
get
that,
into
like,
a really you also get into a really interesting case where asking the network policy people to operate at layer 7 has a lot of fascinating
no, right.
challenges. And east-west auth very often happens at layer 7. So
Yeah,
it's not even clear to me that it is feasible to just totally hand that off to the network policy folks.
no, that's a good
Um,
point. I think most discussion originated on an L4
mhm,
layer. Then, like, we're getting into the discussion, right? Like, do you want to really split
yeah.
L4 and L7? Like, what
Well,
are the opinions there? I'm not sure if we could solve it right now in the room, right? But, like, yeah, Mike have.
So yeah, I think one of the things in terms of like the interop or interaction with network policy that we had a small discussion about at KubeCon like was around basically layering and like at what layer can you do things like a default deny policy and how that stacks with what you may be doing with like IP-based policies in network policy, whether that's the Kubernetes V1 network policy or something more specific like a Cilium or one of like the Red Hat implementations. And basically where we kind of got to, I think, was that it would be implausible for most implementations. I think Cilium is maybe the one counterexample here, but for most of the rest of us, it would be implausible to do something where we have identity-based authorization policy interleaved into network policy rules. So like having a default deny everything by IP, like all traffic, and drop the packets unless it presents this identity.
we, we can kind of do that sort of in Linkerd. Kinda. I'm not gonna try to run down all the cases. We'll just leave it as kinda. Um, but there's another really interesting thing to consider, which is that in Linkerd land, we are, um, I'm deliberately going to phrase this as strongly as possible. We will never accept a world where the network is the basis for your identity. It's not what we do. It's not what we believe is right. So for us, having something at layer 4 that says like, oh yeah, it happens that we will use this particular CIDR for some sort of auxiliary control is great, but
Mhm.
we're never going to give up having proper workload based auth. And
Yeah,
so that makes life even more interesting.
yeah.
But
And
is someone?
realize take never with something of a grain of salt, right? I mean, but yeah.
And I think that's basically like kind of where we got to is that you need to like have it stacked such that you can't. It would be very difficult, let's say, both like UX wise and implementation wise to have in like have these layers like communicate with each other, and it's much simpler to just have a flat like if the bits are allowed to flow, then and only then can you evaluate identity-based auth policy at this like
Yeah,
L4 to L7.
I agree. Yeah, I agree actually.
Yeah.
But Flynn, just on this note, like, is it has someone advocated for having, IPs or something in? I'm just like, maybe I need to learn more. I think what most of the discussion is like about workload, like you could say workload. I'm saying identities, right? But like,
There's a lot of stuff in the broader Kubernetes ecosystem that is, I'm gonna let other people on the call keep me honest here, but I would phrase it as a lot of stuff in the broader ecosystem that is accustomed to using things about the network at layer 4 as a proxy for the identity of the workload. And, that
Okay.
if you don't trust IPAM, basically, if IPAM is not a thing you control, that is a terrible idea. Linkerd's attitude is that we never control IPAM. It's not a thing we do. It's not an area where we want to play. So we rely on having things that don't touch L4 at all for identity. Cilium, I know, takes the attitude that we are the IPAM, and so we can trust that. And Nick and I have had a lot of entertaining philosophical discussions about that, but we'll just leave that aside. I honestly don't know the current state of Istio with respect to that. It's been a while since I've dug into it at that level.
We use MTLS for all identity. We don't trust the network.
Yeah.
Yay!
But I think the status maybe except from Cilium, I think most of the service meshes are we're probably going to end up using MTLS for this, right?
I think the problem, not problem's the wrong word. I think the interesting thing around where auth and identity live when it comes to gateway API versus network policy is that generally in Kubernetes land, identity is a proxy for a service account. And so oftentimes we Flynn talked about the human versus workload level of identity, or of authorization and authentication. Network policy seems to be the better place for some of those things because it does tend to deal with workloads more. And so it seems generally easy to imagine a developer network policy, admin network policy that has service account selector type of things. Again, the tension though is, okay, how's the service account determined? The IP cache approach is one thing, but for most service meshes, or I'll just say anything using MTLS as the basis for identity validation.
Right.
IP caching is not, it's not sufficient.
It's not good
a step
enough.
further. Right. We want to verify what's actually on the wire, and there's not really an API. Like Kubernetes is sort of ignorant of TLS generally. And so there's not really an API for us to utilize that.
You can phrase that more strongly. The current protocols don't allow you to do that at layer 4. You have to interact at layer 7 for that, full stop. Now, at that point, you get into lots of fun discussions about, what about UDP and things like that. But, well,
the layers
the world right now,
right?
Yeah, the world right now has a pretty stark divide between what something operating at layer 4 can do with respect to these sorts of cryptographic identities and what it cannot. I'll also point out that as SPIFFE becomes more commonplace, we also get into a really interesting thing where maybe it's not a service account proxying for your MTLS identity anymore. Maybe it's a SPIFFE ID, and maybe you have to do all that stuff. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the other things, kind of like to the point of Keith mentioning something like developer network policy, which is one of the things that's been proposed for as counterpart to admin network policy as part of the NetPol working group. Basically, it's a challenge for the ergonomics of implementing a CRD like that, with that group also having a significant aversion to things like optional or extended capabilities, where you would have very few implementations that would be able to or interested in supporting both IP-based rules and identity-based rules in a single CRD. So that's kind of what is leading us towards the idea that a separate CRD that is able to be implemented discretely for identity-based authorization is likely to be more readily adoptable and without also complicating the IP-based rules in that layer.
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree with their perspective here that, having optional or, maybe partially implemented APIs in this space is, probably a bad day. So So I
You don't
think
like
that
optional
idea,
authentication things? I don't understand.
right? Well, your implementation might support this auth or it might not,
I mean,
not great.
And
the
if you
fact
don't
is
support it, we
that
can't tell you. That's the other thing. It's like if it's not
Right.
supported, there's no status for any.
yeah, except for the no status bit, you just described life in Ingress land pretty well, right? Um, but the Ingresses are usually pretty good about telling you when they can't support anything.
So it looks like there's
there are things that I do want to add to this, but like I said, I will go last. So I figured I will see if anybody else wants to jump in with more.
This is, I feel like this has already been covered to some extent, but is there anything like, if you are on a mesh that has APIs that overlap with Gateway API, for example, is there anything that would convince you or your users to switch from, I don't know, those APIs to Gateway API? Like is what?
You need carrots instead of sticks.
Yeah.
Is the shortest version of that. And right now, Gateway API is hella short on carrots.
100%.
Right. From the perspective of, especially from Anna's perspective, but the primary user of a mesh is more likely to be Ian than Anna anyway. Even from Ian's perspective, Gateway API is short on carrots. So Linkerd has been taking the approach of some of these things, we only add support for them in Gateway API, although candidly, that's much more likely to be related to bandwidth than anything else.
Yeah.
Trying to go through and add them in both the legacy API and the Gateway API is hard. In fact, it's been hard enough that there are a couple of points where we deliberately did not add something to service profiles, even though people really, really wanted that. And that got us into some trouble that we're, I think, pretty much out of now, but it wasn't fun for a little while. But that's the real issue. And that kind of leads me into, are there use cases that are not supported by Gateway API? Oh, absolutely. 100%. Right. So one of the real challenges to my way of thinking is, how do we add carrots? And I'll pick on a couple of things that we added just recently. We added egress and we added rate limiting, local rate limiting, both on top of Gateway API. And we did it that way. We did it the way that we did it because people were clamoring for it, and there was no way we were going to be able to wait a year to get the gaps through and everything like that. So instead, we did it in a way that's like, okay, here's some prior art for how people are doing this. And maybe that'll help as we go through and start trying to add this stuff to Gateway API. But to me, the biggest thing that we deal with is kind of tying back to what Keith was saying, where the distinction between using Gateway API for north-south and using Gateway API for east-west is, in a lot of ways, much smaller than I think people tend to think. And so 90% of what we talk about where, oh, this would be great for service meshes, it would also be great for north-south users. When I spoke about egress at KubeCon, the way I ended up summarizing this for the audience is that ultimately your parent ref is defining a class of traffic for you. And most of the time, you want to be able to do the same kinds of operations, no matter which class of traffic it is. But yeah, we also end up with things, Lior, to your question about hybrid APIs. Yeah, I think that those are going to stick around for a while. And I think some of that is going to be because there are ways right now, for example, where you can talk about authentication and authorization principles for Linkerd that may or may not make sense for Kuma Mesh or for Cilium or something like that, right? I think all of our ways do make sense for Istio, but I'm not sure. I don't know that we're likely to really standardize on that anytime soon in Gateway API, because that's a pretty deep thing baked into most of these meshes. And I don't know that it makes sense for us to say, you know what, if you want to adopt Gateway API, you can no longer use service accounts as authentication principles, or you must support service accounts for auth principles.
But if, for example,
Both of those are tough to swallow, right? You were going to say?
I'm saying, like, for example, you like, do you think it will be acceptable if we standardize, for example, on SPIFFE IDs, and then we say, hey, we have a standardized policy
You
that
can't
allows
standardize on SPIFFE IDs though, because not everybody supports those either. And again, this is a deep
how hard
thing
it's
baked
going to
in.
be, like, SPIFFE ID eventually it's going to be a string, right? So that's like how.
Yeah, then you can standardize on a string, not a SPIFFE ID, right?
What is it?
Then you can standardize on an opaque string, not a SPIFFE ID.
Right, but it's like, yeah, I mean, probably it's hard. I mean,
What does it mean to standardize on an opaque string?
To be fair, a lot of IAM systems, that identity
I
is a
get
string.
it.
I'm not saying it's a good API,
and
they're
they
not
all suck,
standardized.
right?
Yeah, no, I'm not a pro on standardizing on SPIFFE, despite the fact that our service mesh uses SPIFFE.
Yeah, and we do too outside the cluster, and I'd kind of like us to be able to use it inside the cluster, but there are some things where it's just not clear to me that we get a lot of bang for the buck by standardizing on them in Gateway API, and I think that's okay. There are other places where I think that we do get more bang for the buck. My take on Gateway API is less that the value comes from, damn it, you must support the standard. It feels more like the real benefit to a user comes from the idea that once you learn how an HTTP route works, you should know how it works everywhere. Which is not saying anything about whether implementations should support things that are not HTTP routes. It's kind of, and again, I've used this in a lot of talks, right? Where once you learn how a deployment works, it's supposed to work the same no matter what your Kubernetes implementation is. And we don't talk about OpenShift here. But that portability is great, even though there are things beyond that where you get to extend. The reality is Gateway API is never going to move fast enough for the implementations to not see Gateway API as a burden in some situations. Gateway API is of utility to the users. It is a burden to the implementations. And we're never going to be able to go fast enough to relieve that completely.
And the utility of Gateway API is that, if you think about where things were, 4 years ago, if I'm a new user, to all this different point, if I'm a new user and I want to use an ingress controller, I have to decide if I'm going to learn contours, HTTP proxy. I can't remember what the CRD is called. Like
it doesn't even matter.
CRDs, right? Exactly.
Right.
Everybody had their own thing, and the same way with service metrics, everybody has their own thing.
And even worse, in the Ingress world, you would have two different Ingress controllers using the same thing, or using the same name, but in different ways. We actually have that right now in service mesh land, where I believe Istio and Linkerd both have a thing called an authorization policy, and they are completely different.
Yeah, not great. So Gateway API, if we have standard off, right, then you have one resource that means the same semantic thing across different implementations. Now, it's not a promise that you can just up and move from one to the other with no downtime. That's not the utility that we're providing. It's theoretically you can figure it out, but that's not something that we test, right? It's not a promise that we're making. The utility is that a user who is, again, still there are more new people coming to KubeCon every year. Like, it's majority new users. There's a huge market of people who are just getting started. Those people can just learn Gateway API, and then they're pretty much going to be able to be productive with just that knowledge. Versus before, it was Wild West.
They may not be able to do their entire job with just Gateway API, but it should give them a huge leg up, and I think that that's good. The one thing that I would kind of like right now in terms of, this is only kind of Gamma specific, but it's the most Gamma specific thing I can think of, is there's a long-standing issue with basically define the way the north-south half and the east-west half interact at the boundary. And I think we should do that. I have a lot of opinions on how we should do that. So that's going to be interesting. And Rob, you people over there, you're making that a lot harder. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Not Rob specifically, the folks who want to run Ingress controllers that allege to not live in the cluster. That, oh my God. But anyway, that's
I
the
am going to
one.
be caring about this problem more than I have in the past, I believe.
Yeah, that's the one gamma specific sort of thing that I would really like to see tackled. I'd like to see auth tackled, but I think it's more important to tackle end user auth before trying to do east-west auth. I'd like to see some more attention paid to the idea that your parent ref is effectively defining a class of traffic, and there's stuff I think we can do with that. Certainly in the documentation and education side, but that ain't Gamma, that's Gateway API. There was something else, but I've now forgotten, so I guess it wasn't that important. Crap. Laura, I think your hand was up first.
Yeah, I think it's starting from the end. I think it's somehow Gamma, right? Not just Gateway API, because one of the observation I had, and in fact, one of the things I had first in my agenda for the meeting was that we're adding a lot of features, and like to Gateway, we're doing a lot of stuff, but then like the Gamma is mostly left out, right? Like no conformance for Gamma, right? For example, this request mirroring that we added, right? I've just jumped in to help with percentage space request mirroring. So you see my GitHub comment is like adding Gamma because why not? Like it should be supported. Like, and
Sure.
and Mike was pointed out in one of the meetings of the Gateway meetings before. There are like there's a few work streams right now with Dry Budget and other, I don't remember, that like gonna address both Gamma and Gateway. So one of the things, so to your point that it's not a Gamma problem, it is, because in Gateway we're doing things in a very, people are literally picking on, the supported feature should be this, supported feature should be that, but nobody literally like, go and review for like, okay, why and when this is going to be a reality for Gamma. So, and this is why I'm highly interested in the feedback from the users. I was surprised that you said there are a lot of users, because I'm pretty sure a lot of the things are not working for Gamma. Or like maybe not a lot, but some of the things that should work with Gamma APIs are not working. So that was I was under the impression that not a lot of users use it. I don't see any issues that users open on Gamma or something like that. So that's why that's where I'm coming from.
Well,
I want to. Sorry.
I don't think a user is ever going to open an issue that says Gamma in it.
No, but I'm saying I
you
use
don't
an
see
HTTP
users
route
opening
with a
it.
parent service, parent ref is a service and it's broken because X, Y, and Z.
I think the meshes see those issues, not Gateway API.
Yeah, all right, that's valid.
Yeah,
that's valid.
because we have definitely seen issues like that at Linkerd. We have a couple of really fun ones actually that I did end up bouncing back toward Gateway API, because one of them was a case where like Linkerd and Contour seemed to disagree on the way conflict resolution happened. That was a fun one.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's just like,
and
I just
to be
wanted
clear, the point about the conformance tests not explicitly doing east-west conformance, I think, is a really good one.
And also gaps. You see gaps. Like, why don't we have a Gamma section for gaps, for example, right? Like, supported, like.
I would support something in gaps of both, talk to me about security implications and talk to me about Gamma implementations. I think that would be great.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Rajat has his hands up as well. So I'll go after.
I just wanted to add an example of like what Flynn already said, that the benefit, at least for user, is the transferable knowledge and resources. I think we currently are in a situation like that. So I work at Booking and we have a huge flat network, which basically means we have one network per environment instead of like having different networks per Kubernetes clusters or whatever. And
wait, sorry, you work at booking.com?
Yeah.
Oh, dude, I am going to talk to you after this meeting.
Cool. So we recently started moving from an in-house service mesh to Istio, and we very quickly realized that Istio does not go well with huge flat networks because the EDS, the endpoint discovery, goes like haywire. And we sort of started building an in-house thing just for EDS, and like that works now alongside Istio. And we don't know what the future of the mesh is going to look like for us anymore. And in that scenario where we move from one thing to a second thing and might move to a third thing eventually, like a static resource that we can transfer between those would have been like really helpful. Right now we sort of ended up writing a whole parser that transferred our in-house language to Istio language, and I don't know like what's going to happen in the future that way. So yeah, there are definitely user side benefits to having those static resources across meshes.
Yeah, we hear that a lot actually.
Okay. So Flynn, would you be able to, it can also be offline. So just like what I'm hearing is like, we obviously, it seems like people are interested in auth, maybe some kind of, I don't think we will be able to standardize identity provisioning or like, being standardized on something.
Maybe later. I don't think we should try to do it now.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying, like, would you be able to offline expand on, you were saying that, we're short on carrots, which I 100% agree, but I think it could be a starting point of like, okay, what are the most useful things?
Most useful carrots.
Yeah, to go and start those, right? Like not, and one of them being the boundaries, right? Like people don't understand the boundaries between north, south, and east, west, but all others as well. What's the things that are most impactful to go ahead and implement there that for users you'll have this?
Kind of the funny thing here is that most of the ones that leap immediately to mind as the most useful carrots to get people to try to adopt Gateway API have to do with north-south. And okay, Keith and Mike are both nodding, so that makes me feel better there. John is doing his usual John thing of not doing anything. So my reason for saying that, though, is that a lot of the things that you... Actually, let me phrase that differently. Okay. Service meshes exist to provide observability, reliability, and security. And I'm embarrassed that I said them in that order because I almost always deliberately flip that order front to back. So I don't know what is wrong with me today. Security, reliability, and observability. We can do an enormous amount of that with Gateway API today. And the reason is that observability doesn't actually require a lot of configuration at this level. Observability from a mesh should be a thing that just happens. You don't have to do anything for it. Security for a mesh should start as a thing that just happens, that you don't have to do anything else for. You install Linkerd and you literally get MTLS immediately without any configuration at all. Basic reliability stuff, we are kind of able to do a little bit of, but basically all the places where we fall short for east-west are also places we fall short for north-south because they're exactly the same mechanisms. And so that means that doing them everywhere is more useful than just thinking about them as a gamma thing. And that kind of takes us into authorization and authentication. And those, I just feel like the people who are likely to have the biggest problems are the ones worrying about end user auth right now. I need to think about that one a little bit more, though, because there are certainly cases where, sure, it would be nice to be able to talk about auth policy east-west. It's a little interesting to think about, okay, well, if we don't standardize principles, then what do we pick on and things like that.
I mean, there's probably something that we can do with like optional and lowest common denominator. Like this is what we talked about in the past of like some sort of service account principle, some sort of spiffy principle, and like you don't have to do either or both, but like that gives you a starting point if you want to only have like a gateway API experience.
Yeah, but I think I'd still start by worrying about end user auth, north-south.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like we discussed this with Nick at some point, and like his gap that's up now in provisional state was very much like, let's start with provisional. What is auth? What is auth N? What is auth Z? Start with like user facing flows for north-south, because that is the biggest pain point currently.
Sounds good. Okay, if I have everyone in the same room, do I have another question? Do you see value in separating that's going to be controversial, like identity-based authorization. So with L7 authorization, like, do you think any user would just want to, deploy some kind of a light version of a mesh where they're not doing a lot of, the fancy feature for mesh? They just want authorization between identities. They want telemetry. They want MTLS, but they don't want circuit breaking, like all
You're
that.
asking this in a room with people who are working on Istio Ambient.
I know.
We have a ton of people who deploy Linkerd because somebody walks up and says, "Oh my God, we need MTLS tomorrow for compliance," and then they slap Linkerd on, and it just works.
Absolutely.
Yep. Literally the only feature that I think got used for OSM, rest in peace, was MTLS. Like that's what 90% of our users were using.
Yeah.
So like, yeah.
Now, worth pointing out, in a lot of situations, people install it because they need to be able to look the auditors in the eye and say, absolutely, all of our network traffic is encrypted. And then it's the slippery slope, and they end up adopting everything because they suddenly realize, like, oh my God, we can do multi-cluster now, and that's obviously, that's fine with us. By the way, multi-cluster is another meshy thing that I think we could think about maybe in 2027 or something like that. But it's, as I've said before in Gateway API, the moment you start talking about multi-cluster Gateway API, you instantly have to bite off this huge chunk of interop concerns. And I do not want to think about that for a little while yet.
Yeah.
As much as I'm sure that Istio Ambient will solve all these problems and everybody will be able to talk to it and it'll cure cancer as well.
From purely, Lior, the like ergonomics of a L4 identity-based policy versus like adding L7 rules or callouts to some other service or whatever like that. I think that there is value for an end user in not having those as two separate resources. So like from a historical perspective, Console for a long time when I worked on it started with only L4 authorization policy. It was identity based, and it's either the service is allowed to talk to you or it's denied, and that's it. And there we encourage people to do like a cluster wide default deny and then just allow list only the services they're allowed to talk to you. And then once you have that in place, being able to tweak and tune and additively say, oh, for this one that was just allowed, actually, I only want to allow to the /API path or something like that. So I think that there is value in not having that be a separate thing that you have to manage and juggle.
One of the interesting things about thinking in terms of the parent ref defining a class of traffic is that it drives home the fact that almost everything you want to do is independent of what class of traffic it is. As soon as you start doing things at layer 7, well, of course you want to be able to do path filtering at layer 7 because that's a valid layer 7 thing. It doesn't matter if it's east-west or north-south, and things like that. It gets interesting sometimes.
Okay.
And
I think it'll be harder to converge on to standardize L7 authorization things because every implementation has their own stuff.
I don't think it's actually that. I don't think that getting something that's basic and workable would be any harder than like what we have on HTTP route today. Like I think that it is very possible to get kind of like a minimum viable L7 rules or something like that. And to be clear, like these should be optional. Like I think all of the L7 stuff on an authorization policy should be optional. Like if you want to say that authorization policy and having some sort of identity based thing, if you implement it, then you have to do some sort of L4 identity based thing. That seems reasonable, but then like I think that we want to have space for both users and implementations and new implementations even potentially to just like only implement the L4 stuff. And the L7, you can either have your implementation,
but then it gets weird.
Right, or or be conditional depending on your architecture, and maybe that dynamically changes your infrastructure if it needs to.
But if
or
it's not
maybe
separate
just rejects it,
policies,
tells you,
if
wow,
it's not separate policies, it gets weird to implementing half a CRD again, right?
Sorry, say that again.
Yeah, I think that the concern is like if you have any form of authorization policy, API, whatever, and an implementation can only support part of it, it's very confusing. So the idea that you could potentially have a separate L7 API that happens to be a superset of an L4 one may be somewhat safer.
I think that might be a thing that feels like a thing we might want to do, not in the next 2 minutes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all of our choices there seem complex,
feels like
right?
you're opting for safety at the expense of the user experience potentially. It's yeah, I don't know. There's definitely trade-offs there of like how awkward is this to work with versus I use this one thing and either my implementation supports these optional components or it doesn't. And as long as it's clear how to understand what the effective policy is, then I think that's really the goal, is making sure that it's clear and understandable for the user.
You just described the difficult thing about policy. Awesome. The point about safety in competition with or in tension with usability is a really good one. There are places where I think that Gateway API as a whole has opted for safety at the expense of usability. I think that's hurting us. Rob is smirking because he has been on the receiving end of various versions of that discussion. It is really interesting to think about things like, is there a way that we could talk about auth and leave the principles implementation specific? And I mean, I'm not sure we really have a choice there, but it's an interesting question. Even the L4 versus L7 stuff is interesting because, well, right now we don't really do a lot at layer 4 in Gateway API, and that would need to change in some ways, although that may need to change anyway.
I mean, we have existing patterns for that with like domain prefixed keys for other fields. I forget where that is, but we have existing patterns for being able to do implementation specific things as an extensibility in and otherwise just like thing that has, here are the ones that are part of the core spec. It's 2, and you can easily add your own as an implementation. As a time check, we're about out of time. I know we haven't really heard much from Christina. I'm just curious if there's anything that you want to add from your Cilium's perspective about like what you want to see for Gamma things.
Also, I think Christina's been typing the notes, so thank you. Much appreciated.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing it would be the auth stuff, just clarifying that and then following through. I think that's the largest thing. And then carrots, making things more consumable for people at KubeCon. I think like we see the most growth after KubeCon when people feel inspired and stuff. And I think we're gonna have to somehow like leverage that in order for adoption. But yeah.
Somebody's going to start showing up with stuffed carrots to give out at KubeCon.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for writing notes as well. And yeah, I mean, thanks for joining. I think we could follow offline, sorry. And yeah, start to get some things in Gamma.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
See you.
Enjoy.
Bye, folks.